If we settle down over here, we'll start. Is this on? Yes, it is. Thank you. This panel is the current state of Hispanic politics, understanding the electorate and policy. And we have enough political talent over here to be able to weigh down this stage. What I want to do is I want to start off with the pollsters talking about the lay of the land, and then have the guys that run the campaigns talk about their experiences in terms of just how the electorate is changing, how campaigns are changing, and then I've got some questions, provocative and not, in terms of the transition in Texas politics. So let me start off with my friend and colleague at the University of Texas, Daron Shaw. Daron joined the faculty at the University of Texas in the fall of 1994. Most recent of his many, many publications is his book, Unconventional Wisdom, published on Oxford University Press, which examines across time survey data to inform the popular conversation about voting in elections in the United States. Before UT, Professor Shaw was a senior national data analyst for the 1992 Bush Quayle campaign, and later on was director of election studies for the 2000 Bush-Cheney campaign and a consultant for the 2004 Bush-Cheney campaign and the Republican National Committee. He also served as a consultant for the Tomas Rivera Policy Institute and is currently advising and conducting the Texas poll. So, Daron, tell us about your lay of the land in terms of looking at what your polls have shown in terms of the Hispanic electorate in Texas today.
Sure. Well, first of all, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to such a nice gathering. I also appreciate Paul going outside of alphabetical order, because usually with people like this on the panel, if I'm last, people sneak out of the room after they get done before me. So I have a captive audience. I'll try to take advantage of that. I'm going to be really dry this morning, and usually I'm not that dry, so I apologize in advance for that. But I figure I ought to give you something to make it worth your while. And so what I'm going to do is essentially go over kind of chapter and verse some findings that came out of a spring survey that I did for the Texas Lyceum. The Texas Lyceum poll is a nonpartisan, non-for-profit organization. The poll was conducted, it's the first one we've done, and the sort of notion was, for a state as large as Texas and as politically significant as Texas, we don't have many polls. In fact, outside of the Texas poll, which is infrequent and is in the field a long time and oftentimes doesn't really suit some of our more immediate interests, there's really nothing out there. And so that was kind of the genesis. Now, the thing I liked about the poll that we did in the spring was we had an opportunity to do a significant subsample of Hispanic voters. And so the results I'm going to give you today are derived from about 330 Hispanic interviews in the context of a 1,000-person sample of the state of Texas. Okay, so you got a plus or minus error of about 6 points or so, but not too bad. I should also mention, for those of you who would ask this question, and you rightfully should, it was bilingual interviewers and a bilingual instrument. And it was real education doing, idiomatic translation of a political survey. This is something that ought to be done more often, but is actually done surprisingly infrequently. So, the focal point was actually social attitudes and attitudes towards the separation between church and state. So we have a subset of questions in there about that. But let me kind of begin with some quick facts. Remember, these results are self-reported. So if they don't jibe with your sense of reality, for instance, on the first line, which would be the percent who were registered to vote, that's because these are what people are saying. According to the sample, we had 60% of Hispanics said they were registered to vote. The comparison here is interesting, though. 92% of whites and 92% of African Americans claim to be registered to vote. We asked them sort of on a continuum, how often do you vote? 12% of Hispanics said they always vote in elections. 33% of whites or Anglos and 24% of blacks. Okay, now, obviously, these numbers are biased upwards in terms of who actually votes, but the differences, I think, are really illustrative. We asked them how interested you were in politics, and 19% of Hispanics said they're extremely interested in politics. We didn't differentiate between state or local or national. 41% of whites said they were extremely interested, and 30% of blacks said they were extremely interested. Some numbers kind of on the lay of the land politically. We asked what's known generically as the track question. Is the country moving in the right direction, or are we off on the wrong track? 63% of Hispanics said that we were off on the wrong track. 59% of whites and 78% of African Americans said wrong track. The most important problem nationally was identified as Iraq by all groups. Amongst Hispanics, 42% identified Iraq as the most important problem. Within the state, 21% of Hispanics identified education as the most important problem. That was the top vote getter at the state level. A close second was immigration. 19% of Hispanics identified immigration. And the comparison point here is interesting. 26% of whites identified immigration as the top issue in the state, and that was the top vote getter amongst whites or Anglos. This question really kind of was interesting to me. We asked a battery of questions on the economy. We asked, is your economic situation better or worse off or the same compared to a year ago? Amongst Hispanics, 30%, I'll give you the negative side of this coin, worse off. 30% of Hispanics said they were worse off economically. 32% of whites said they were worse off. 57% of African Americans said they were worse off. Flip it around. We asked them, how do you expect to be in the future? Do you expect to be better off, worse off, or the same? 59% of Hispanics said they expect to be better off. Comparison point, 33% of blacks said they expect to be better off. So the racial ethnic divider is very interesting. We asked a voucher question, and we actually, my colleague Professor Jim Henson can attest to this. When you ask a voucher question, everybody and his grandmother seems to have a strong opinion on that. And no matter what you find, you're going to get trashed by somebody. We asked a question, and we asked a question that's been asked. Our goal in this instrument was not to reinvent the wheel. All the questions that we used have been used in national surveys and found to be both valid and reliable. I won't bother you with definitions of validity and reliability, but we wanted to ask questions that had a track record. We asked a fairly generic voucher question. We had 74% of Hispanics respond in pro-voucher fashion. 70% of whites, 59% of blacks. The word voucher was used in the question, which is usually kind of a negative signal. Support for vouchers declines when you actually use the word voucher in the question. We were criticized because we didn't talk about all the horrible things that would happen if you had vouchers. Well, needless to say, we did the best we could. We used a question with a track record. Is it possible that these responses, that the particular responses are influenced by question wording? Of course. Right. But the finding is what it is, and the racial differences, I think, are kind of interesting. Moving along, just a couple, since I mentioned the focal point was religion and social values, the abortion question. Let me give you the two extremes. Abortion should always be permitted, sort of women's choice, carte blanche. 29% of Hispanics opted for that. Abortion should never be permitted under any circumstances, 25%. So very interesting balance, with the balance obviously falling in the middle, some sort of restrictions on abortion. Compared to African Americans, 48% said abortion should always be left to the woman, 12% said never permitted. Right, so interesting differences. Whites sort of fall in between. Support for the death penalty, 60% for Hispanics, 80% for whites, and 45% for African Americans. Okay, indulge me for just a sec before I get to the politics. A couple of religious questions. The Bible is the literal word of God. Yes or no? 75% of Hispanics said yes. Bible, literal word of God. 62% of whites, 85% of African Americans. All right. Personally consider yourself born again. This is obviously a question that doesn't play as well with the Catholic population as opposed to a Protestant. But 33% of Hispanics identified themselves as having had a born again experience. 50% of whites, 72% of African Americans. So sort of stunning numbers of religion. And people who study religion know this is not terribly distinct. They're a little higher in Texas than they are nationally, but they're not that far off from what you'll find in national surveys. Okay, raw politics, and I'll get out. 41% of Hispanics said they intend to vote in the Democratic presidential primary. Only 16% said they intended to vote in the Republican primary. Comparison point, amongst whites, 28% said they'd vote in the Democratic primary, 44% in the Republican primary. And as you might imagine, amongst African Americans, 59% said they'll vote in the Democratic primary. Only 8% of African Americans said they'll vote in the Republican primary. Democratic choices, amongst Hispanics, Clinton, 24%. Gore, who we included as an option, 12%. Obama, 8%. Richardson, 6%. Edwards, 3%. And the remainder undecided. We didn't press who do you lean towards, ask questions like that. We could have, but this far out, we left it as it was. Amongst whites, 11% for Clinton, 7% for Gore, 14% for Obama. Richardson only draws 1% amongst Anglos, and Edwards draws 11%. Right. Amongst African Americans, just a point of comparison, 32% Clinton, 28 Obama amongst African Americans. Okay, general election matchup, and I'll bow out here. Right now, the split is hugely dominated by don't knows. But if you ask a generic candidate question, Democrat, Republican, 30% of Hispanics say they'll vote Democrat, 11 Republican, with almost 60% saying, I don't know yet. So a huge advantage, for the Democrats, but lots of undecideds. Amongst Anglos, amongst whites, 43% Republican, 20 Dem. And amongst African Americans, 46% Democrat, 8% Republican, with the balance undecided. So obviously very preliminary results, lots of undecideds and indecision, but they are the most recent large N survey data that we have from the state of Texas. So I'll leave it at that and certainly be responsive to questions later on.
We're going to open this up to questions after our panelists are done. By the way, I want to acknowledge I'm delighted to see Senator Barrientos here in the audience today, and thank him for his fine service for Austin for so many years. Sticking with pollsters before I get to the guys that are actually out there every day running those campaigns, Mike Baselice is the president of Baselice and Associates, a survey research firm which conducts opinion polling for decision-making in politics and public affairs. While Michael specializes in consulting for Republican candidate races in the state of Texas, he has extensive experience in political campaigns and issue referendum projects throughout the United States, and he is quite obviously the most successful pollster in the state of Texas today. Mike, what have you seen out there in terms of the Hispanic electorate in your polling in the recent times?
I think there's a number of things that I can say. I concur with what Daron has found in his recent polling. We have, I'm going to talk a little bit about issues, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how Hispanics are voting and what we might expect to see across the state of Texas as we go through this decade into the next decade. I kind of go back to a point at which my friend Frank Guerra was working on Henry Bonilla's first congressional race, and it was kind of a stunning victory for the Republicans to have won that seat. It was not supposed to be won by a Republican, and soon thereafter, I remember Congressman Bonilla and Frank Guerra were approached at a fundraiser for K. Bailey Hutchison, who was running in the spring of 1993 for that open Senate seat. And so I think it was David Beckwith and Kay Bailey descended upon you and Congressman Bonilla and said, what did you say, issue-wise, to get the Hispanic vote? And Frank told me this story. He says, hey, we just kind of looked at each other, Congressman Bonilla and I, said, what do you mean? Well, you must have said something really unique to get these Hispanics to vote Republican. No, we just spoke to them. We didn't ignore them. And for a long time, Republicans would ignore Hispanics and just not even pay attention to them. They just figured they would not get their vote. Well, the Bonilla campaign had to talk to the Hispanic voters in that district. They made up about half of the votes. And so what they found out was that, guess what? Hispanics cared, by and large, about many of the same things that everybody else cared about. It wasn't some magic formula. We did some testing in a subsequent election cycle and found out if you were going to hire somebody and you were the employer, what types of values would you look for in that employee? Well, if you're looking at an employee, what types of things would you want that employee to hold dear and important? And then we ran a comparable set of issues for a candidate for Congress. What types of things would you want that candidate to espouse and champion for you in Congress? And we found out that education and healthcare issues and employment were the big three issues. And when I look at our recent poll that we just came out of the field with last week, and we gave it a number of issues that the legislature and here in Texas should work on, we had affordable health care was selected by 26% of the voters, but by 31% of the Hispanic voters. We found out that education was selected by 17% of all voters, but 22% of Hispanic voters. And so there's still a little bit more leaning, just a little bit more leaning towards the healthcare and education issues by the Hispanic community. In looking at a lot of cross-tabulations over the years, and I have 6,489 that I collected from just the surveys I conducted in 2006's election, and there's another 3,500 from tracking. And they really, when I looked at the crosstab and I looked at how the Hispanic voters in our surveys were voting, there wasn't much difference between 2002 and 2006. And what we found is when you take out the ticket splitters, or the people that vote independent, and you look at the proportion of Hispanics that are voting Republican versus Democrat, it's about 30% of Hispanic voters in Texas are voting Republican. The other 70% are voting Democrat. Some candidates, you might have heard George Bush's exit poll number was he was getting 44% of the Hispanic vote in 2004. Some additional research was done on that exit polling, and they looked at maybe some adjustments, and I think, Daron, they got it down to like 41%, which was still high in a lot of people's minds. In both 2002, whether it was Rick Perry running against Tony Sanchez for governor, or in a multi-candidate race, we found him getting in the mid-30s with the Hispanic vote. We found other candidates getting, like John Cornyn back in 2002. We found he was getting about 30% of the Hispanic vote. And Karl Rove asked me back in '94, I wasn't working on Bush's campaign, but he wanted me to look at a collection of surveys we had at the time when I was with the Terrence Group, and he wanted me to look and see what was the threshold that a Republican candidate needed in order to win statewide. Because back in '94 was probably the last year in which things in the state were, I call, true parity. We found out that you might get somewhere in the lower side of 24–25% of the Hispanic community voting Republican back then. But if you could get somewhere in the high 20s, you just may win statewide races. And so that's what George W. Bush was looking for against Ann Richards, and he was able to just get that. To show how that number stayed true for a number of election cycles, we saw David Dewhurst get about 27% of the Hispanic vote back in 2002 against John Sharp on our polls, and while Rick Perry was getting 35% against a Hispanic candidate. Now, what does this mean for the future for Hispanic votes? If you just looked at the fact that, not that there may be low 30% range for the Hispanic population, but you really have to look at who's playing the game on Election Day. And that brings you down from about 22% of all registered voters having a Hispanic surname down to something closer to 16%, maybe 16.5% of the voters who turn out. You can look at voter files and see this, that have a Hispanic surname are in fact Hispanic. And so the percentage of those that are participating in the turnout are about 1 out of 6 Hispanic. The other 5 out of 6 are not Hispanic. And at the 30% of Republicans voting Hispanic, Republicans are going to hold a lead for more than a decade. Now, the pendulum took a long time to swing this way for this to become a Republican state. That's why we have all the Republicans have all the statewide offices. So everyone wants to know, what point does it swing back? Well, as long as Hispanics continue to vote 70% Democrat, 30% Republican, it stays a Republican state maybe up until 2030. Now, how do you expedite that if you're interested in Democrats taking back offices statewide? Well, you could go out and try and get a higher percentage of the vote, and if you get 20% of Hispanics voting Republican, 80% voting Hispanic, you come closer to parity at about 2020. It's hard to do that, though, because the Hispanic community is not going up in the Democrat portion of the vote. It's becoming a smaller portion. Another way is, quite frankly, to increase the turnout. If you increase the turnout of the Hispanics and you make them, let's say, by 2010, 20% of the turnout, which I don't see it being much more than the high teens, but if you got it to be 20% of the turnout, all of a sudden things close. And we get closer to parity, and it's about 51.7% Republican, 48.3%. Right now, it's about a 9-point difference. So you break that about a 3.5-point difference, that's a much closer deal. And the point at which you're really at parity, if you can get 20% of the Hispanic community only voting Republican, and you get 22% of all the turnout, 2 out of 9 voters being Hispanic, then 2020 is the year in which things turn over. But I really don't see things happening well beyond 2020 in terms of when the state gets back into parity. Even though the Hispanic community is a very fast-growing community and an increasing higher percentage of the electorate, there's also a growing Asian community, and Anglos aren't getting smaller. They're just not growing at the same rate that the Hispanic community is growing.
One of the people that's trying to have this happen before 2020 is James Aldrete. He's the president of Message Audience presentation, an Austin-based political communications company. In the last election cycle, Aldrete and his shop worked in numerous campaigns, including voter contact mail for rural areas and battleground states, Hispanic media and television and radio in 5 states, 3 Texas congressional races, and a number of state representative races in Oklahoma. And I'm very happy he's awake, seeing as how he and his wife had a newborn 10 days ago.
I think really one of the most promising things that's happening on the Democratic side that I think it's kind of either merging with Hispanics, or I like to think that Hispanics are pushing, is really that Democrats are changing the way that they talk. And it's embracing the metaphor really of America as a family. Did some focus groups, or participated in some focus groups with a nonprofit progressive organization, and the Anglo executive director was saying, what is it with you guys? I spent 20 years trying to get away from my family, and all you guys can talk about is family, family, family. I think when you really look at when the downturn for Democratic prospects in the state really accelerated, I think it's kind of emblematic with Phil Gramm in the early 1980s. He was a Democrat, resigned, ran back as Republican, and very soon was elected statewide. Phil Gramm used to have the joke that he too had a liberal bleeding heart. He just kept his in a jar on top of the mantle. And that really works. I mean, when you're embracing kind of America as a family, you're really switching from a white Protestant belief in individualism versus a much more Catholic belief about communalism. And the whole idea that, I guess, the 2 basic most devastating charges that have been out there against Democrats is bleeding heart liberal, which is the motivation for us being tax suspenders, supposedly. And the second is kind of moral relativism. And to a certain extent, both of those parts have been more part of the Anglo part of the Democratic Party, and it's because it still had that individualistic part. Graham's joke doesn't really work if you have obligations to other people. If you're part of a larger community and you're connected with stuff, you're not doing something out of a bleeding heart, you're doing something out of an obligation. To a large extent, Republicans, I think they have an advantage, and to a certain extent, there is an opportunity for them to speak with Hispanics because Catholic doctrine is a little bit more conservative when it comes to social issues. But I think part of what they miss is what I just call cultural Catholicism, and it is that framing of our mind of how we look at the world much more as a collective. You go to church, we don't go to a service called individuals, we go to a service called Mass. So from the start, we're told that individuals aren't important. We're forced to kneel, and I challenge anyone to get on their knees and then to think very highly of themselves or not have a little bit of humility. The Bible's read to us. We don't read the Bible. We're getting a little bit better because the priest no longer has his back to the audience and actually recognize that we're there. But
We're going back to that, though.
And then when you are recognized as an individual, it's time to confess, and you're reminded about what you've done wrong. So we walk into Mass, we're forced to kneel, we speak when spoken to, and then we're told how bad we are. But what that does set up really is that sense that the larger group is more important. If you go to any kind of Hispanic dominant community and you ask, who is so-and-so, the answer won't be what their job is or anything about that individual. It's their family tree. Your identity becomes how you are connected to a larger group. And to a large extent, that is changing how Democrats speak and approach issues. And it allows you to take things such as CHIP as a moral obligation to other people, as opposed to something you're doing just out of the kindness of your heart. And I think still on that, I think Cornyn and Republicans and Bush are still going to have problems on that. I think when you go into even an Anglo-dominant community, such as the most Republican district held by a Democrat, which is Chet Edwards' district, Arlene Wogemuth was defeated basically just on the CHIP issue and the fact that these kids were denied. I believe it was Fabrizio did the 10-year review of where Republicans stand, and that drop with Hispanics that is occurring is not just because of the specifics of the immigration debate, but it is that cutting off of people, and it is that lack of seeing seeing this country as a united type of family. It really is affecting, I think, the way a lot of progressive organizations are doing things too. There were focus groups with the Sierra Club, and they were just looking at their logo and showing it to Hispanics. And it's a lone man with a walking stick walking into the woods. And Hispanics thought that was crazy. Why would someone walk into the woods by themselves? That makes no sense. There's bears in the woods. Or maybe there's not a bear in the woods. But it is that idea that, then they have, families having picnics out in the park. That is environmentalism to Hispanics. Second, even with Planned Parenthood on the choice issue, they had their focus groups, and typically it's one woman saying, I have choices. When this was done in New York among Puerto Ricans, they always wanted to see, a daughter graduating with her father. They wanted to see a woman with her boyfriend. It is still about a larger thing. And even when I've worked with some Planned Parenthood groups, they won't always include some of them, and we're kind of getting over it to include. But you also have to talk about a woman's right not to have children. It's really talking about a woman's right when to have children and how many. And when you have that power, when and how many, it comes without saying it that you have the right not to have children. But with Hispanics, you don't talk about the right not to have children. It just goes against it. I was talking about kind of that cultural Catholicism. And it really provides, one of the most persuasive weapons that every Hispanic mother knows, and that's Catholic guilt. There is no such thing that I'm aware of Protestant guilt. But Catholic guilt comes really when your fear of being ostracized. And it goes back to being that part of a larger group. And what you see, too, and it really becomes the advantage, I think, that is heading back in both how the issues are framed, is in Hispanic culture, that guilt means that you have an obligation to the sacrifices of those who came before you and your parents and your grandparents, and you have that obligation to your children as well. And it goes back to that bleeding heartness and that charge. There is nothing welfareness about meeting your obligation back and then continuing that, passing on that guilt to the next generation. So I think a large part of what is shaping is not just the numbers and when is the sleeping giant going to awake, but it really is, it's affecting the way the Democrats are talking, and it provides us to talk from a larger position of strength and from a moral obligation on issues.
James, I'll meet your Catholic guilt and raise you with Jewish neurosis. Coming down the line over here, Kelly Fero was raised in Argentina, educated in Mexico, and he's been a chief strategist for candidates and elected officials around the world. He was a policy and political strategist for the Mexican ambassador to the United States, helped Vice President Guerra create the National Performance Review, and served as a communications advisor for Nicolas Sarkozy in his race for presidency of France. Formerly a director of Public Strategies Incorporated, is the co-founder of Fero Hewitt Global, a political and public affairs firm based in Austin. Kelly.
A Democrat who works for the French. I'm just, I might as well just retire right now. I wanted to say something about an issue that, Mike didn't address in his polling. I know he tests this, and I know Daron does too. And it's economic security is an issue that ties into a lot of the values that James talked about, and that we're seeing in polling, and we just know instinctively that this is an issue of growing concern among Hispanic voters. I call it the Hood Robin theory, the opposite of Robin Hood. We have an administration in a sort of a political environment that steals from the poor and gives to the rich. And this contributes to a sense of economic insecurity out there and pension problems. And these are not the issues like CHIP or the broader issues of education and health care that always are talked about, and that, deservedly so, the top issues among Hispanic voters. But another issue driven by those values issues is the economic security thing. The U.S. has the worst savings rate of any industrialized nation. It's the previous 42 presidents accumulated as much debt as the current president has. This is a drag on the economy. It is difficult for families to see their way clear to pay for health care for themselves if they don't get it from their employer, to save for the children's education. And I think it contributes to an unease and to the number Daron mentioned, that 2/3 of Hispanics think we're headed on the wrong track. So my Senator Barrientos, who takes a backseat to no one in having fought for Hispanic rights through the years, Senator Barrientos, a generation ago, was in the fields fighting on those issues. This generation, I think, is moving into issues of more economic security, and I think that's, I'd be interested to know whether Mike does see that in his polling. I see it in our polling as an emerging issue among Hispanic voters. I don't know if you see that.
No, economic security is when we're talking about jobs, having not just a job that you think will be there tomorrow, but a decent paying job that allows you to afford more for your family is very important in the Hispanic community. On the voucher side, you know, one of the things I have learned from some voucher or school choice work is that the Hispanic community, more so than the African American community, and certainly much more than the Anglo community, is interested in anything, any vehicle. They're in support of any vehicle that will give them choices and options to better their children's education. Now, that's not talking about the pluses and minuses of vouchers or school choice. It's just that you give them an option or an opportunity, they want it on the table.
Moving down the line, Frank Guerra. And by the way, Frank, thank you so much for being instrumental in getting Congressman Bonilla to change his plans and come over here today. Frank is the founder and the CEO of Guerra, DeBerry, Coody, a full-service advertising, marketing, and public relations firm based in San Antonio, Texas. Now in its 11th year, GDC offers general market as well as Hispanic capacities for regional and national clients. Frank served on the National Bush-Cheney re-election team, working in general market as well as Hispanic advertising in the 2002 election cycle. GDC served as the Hispanic agency of record for the Jeb Bush for governor campaign in Florida and the Rick Perry governor campaign in Texas, garnering record-setting votes for both candidates. Frank Guerra.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thrilled to be here. Years from now, when I look back and say, wow, I got a chance to participate on this very auspicious day, and the timing of it is amazing, because I think one of the most exciting things to happen in Hispanic politics in the last 10 years happened 2 days ago in San Antonio. Are you aware of this? Yeah. My 13-year-old son was elected president of the student body. That. I got to tell you the slogan. He came up with a slogan. I wanted Mike to test it, but we ran out of time. And money. He said, Dad, I got a slogan. What is it, buddy? The Guerra era. I was like, I like that. So, anyway, I'm going to take a little bit different approach today. The Guerra War. It could be that too. It could be that too. I'm going to take a little bit different approach today. I'm not a pollster, so I can't tell you how Hispanics are going to vote, what message is going to move them in what direction, by what degree. But what I would like to talk about is what I think the Hispanic mindset is going to be going into 2008 and well beyond. And it has to do with the dynamic shift that's taking place right now with Hispanics and has been taking place for a while. And that shift is really most evident when you look at Hispanics from a consumer standpoint, of consumer of goods and services. So for just a moment, I'm going to pause politics and I'm going to talk about Hispanics as consumers. Then I'm going to show you how that shift, I think, is going to affect how we view not only next year, but politics into the forever future. So let me begin with this, and I'll state this you wouldn't know unless you were living under a rock for the last 10 years. Hispanics are growing really fast. We're spending more money than we've ever spent before. Next year, when we hit 08, we're going to top $1 trillion in spending. That's economic power. And the corporate response has been predictable. They're spending more money on Hispanic. You see Hispanics in general market spots. And by the way, we do politics, but we really sort of built our business on corporate work, so I'm telling from personal experience. You see bilingual advertising, you see Spanish language ads on English language TV, and all companies are talking Hispanic. But what's really interesting, and this is where the shift has taken place, and I think you'll see it as soon as I talk about it, is what the market response has been, how Hispanics are responding to this. There are now rising expectations. You better be talking to me if you want my money. We have more choices. We have greater product knowledge than ever before. We are shifting our media habits, and we're exploring more. Let me tell you, not too many years ago, here's what they would say about the Hispanic consumer. You get them early, you got them forever. The ultimate brand loyal human being on the face of the earth, not anymore. There's going to come a time when Hispanics are going to go from being the most brand loyal to the least brand loyal, because we're at a unique place where everybody's talking to us, and they better keep talking to us. because it fundamentally comes down to this. To have economic power, Hispanics must exercise economic choice. If we buy only one bottled water, one brand of suit, one kind of car, then everybody's going to stop talking to us. The more we spread it out and the more preciously we hold that dollar, the more economic power we have. Now, let's bring politics back in the room. Let's shift the realm from economics to politics. The more that Hispanics hold on to their vote, the more political power they will have. If they want political power, they have to exercise political choice. So obviously I've worked on Republican, campaigns. But first and foremost, I really believe that Hispanics ought to gain more political power in this country. So I want the Republicans to go after them. I want the Democrats, the Green Party, the Libertarians, everybody come after us. The more they come after us, the more political power we're going to have. I think it's a foregone conclusion, and it's where things are going. So here's where the mind shift is. The more we really fundamentally get the economic model, the more over time we're going to get the political piece of this as well. And so the question becomes, who is it that's going to win this battle? I'm going to tell you a little story that I heard years ago, and it was a story about a young man who goes to a wise old man, and he says, "I have a battle going on in my soul between good and evil, and it's like they're two dogs and they're tearing at each other, and which one is going to win?" And the wise man says, "The dog that will win is the one that you feed the most." So, who's going to win in the future? Obviously, there are some Hispanics that are Democrats. There are Hispanics who are Republicans. But the great middle, who's going to win that? It's going to be measured cycle to cycle. Because the more we realize that we're going to hold our votes to the end and make a decision, the more power we're going to have. In 2004, after the presidential campaign, I was on a panel with a guy from the Kerry campaign, and the question came to me. So, do you now own 41, 42% of the Hispanic vote? And I said, absolutely not. It's just what we earned this time. In 2006, I was asked by a reporter, well, Republicans didn't do very well with, Hispanics in a lot of areas. Have you lost ground? I said, absolutely not. Because that assumes that we own the ground. And we don't. And no one really does, that middle ground. So from cycle to cycle, it's going to be a battle. And whoever does it the best, does it the hardest, and truly connects, that in that cycle is going to be the winner, whether it's a party structure or whether it's an individual candidate. I think on the long term, Hispanics stand a very good chance on a very basic level. Republicans stand a very good chance on a basic level to make tremendous inroads within the Hispanic community. And hopefully during the Q&A, we'll get a chance to talk about that, because I've got my friends still sitting over here, Louis, and I want to give him a chance to talk, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. So thank you.
I never would have guessed that now that this conference is less than 2 hours old between Senator Zaffirini and Frank Guerra, we now have stories about dogs, cats, and mice. Last but definitely not least is Louis Saenz, and definitely not least because he was the manager in the only successful gubernatorial campaign and one of the weirdest gubernatorial campaigns in the history of Texas in this last election cycle. He's the principal of Saenz Public Affairs, providing government relations and public affairs services to clients such as Time Warner, Cable, Philip Morris, Vulcan Materials, Lehman Brothers in the state of Nuevo Leon, Mexico, and others. Prior to starting his own firm, he was the director of Texans for Rick Perry, Governor Perry's political organization, serving as the primary campaign spokesman while also managing day-to-day activities for the governor's re-election in 2006, and included in his many previous political positions was serving on the staff with former Congressman Henry Bonilla.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. It's certainly an honor and a pleasure to be here, and it's changed. I've been in politics and public policy for about 17 years now. Started in 1990 at the Heritage Foundation in what was a somewhat conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. Somewhat. A little bit conservative. And I was interviewing, and they put me in what was called the New Majority Project. And so it went over for my first day, reported the New Majority Project, said I thought I was going to work in the Congressional Assessment Project, which was overseeing Congress. I said, no. He says, you're Hispanic. We want you to help us with Hispanics and figure out how they vote. And then office and right next to me was an African-American lady. It's like, hey, can't we just blend in with them and help on the other issues, not just because we're Hispanic and African-American? So about 7 or 8 months later, ended up on the Congressional Assessment Project because I was finally able to convince them of the same advice that I've given people that I've worked for over the years is Hispanics, we have the same concerns as everyone else. I mean, I think it's been echoed, James on to Mike and Kelly and Frank, Daron. I mean, it's just not, an issue of the border, or if it's immigration, or Spanish as a second language or English as a second language. It's not. It's economics. It's everything. It's showing us some respect, which the corporate clients are doing, and which political clients have to do soon. I've always, and if you look back at the Governor Perry campaign this last time around, and even in 2002 against Tony Sanchez, we went down and talked, whether we were at the greater, Houston Partnership or down at, Brownsville Chamber of Commerce, the same issues of economics, issues of education, issues that for the future of America. I think, of Texas. Daron talked about, the number you talked about on Hispanics are optimistic. 60% of people think Hispanics have got a better future. I mean, you all know that most of our grandparents, a lot of them didn't finish school. They went to work. They made our parents finish high school. Our parents made me go to college. I'm expecting my daughters to go beyond college and into graduate programs and to do more than we've done before. And so we have to go out and talk to, Hispanic population with the same message we're talking to the general population. We don't need to go from a Republican standpoint, which have been successful in the last few races that I've worked on and advised, and set up a different Hispanic group, Hispanics for whomever it is. Those people get, the Hispanics in that group get just as upset as anyone else. How come we have to be, singled out and be off on the side? We want to be part of the mainstream. I mean, we want to be recognized as being, contributing. We've gone from, Senator Barrientos, fighting, in the streets for our rights to participate, to people now, fighting in corporate boardrooms to get, more Hispanics hired. And I think the more that politicians include Hispanics at the leadership table, I think the better off, as far from a Republican standpoint, we're going to be. Otherwise, skipping the Univision debate, when John McCain was the only person to, it's a sign of respect. Show up. Talk your issues. Don't just say, no, we can't make it, we have a scheduling conflict. You show up and you show the respect that so many of us have worked hard to receive, and that so many of us, so many Hispanics around the country deserve now. So anyway, appreciate being here. Thank you.
Before I open this up for questions, and I actually want to go a little bit further on a point that Louise made. And we've been collecting these. Ronnie Stidman, the director of the center, has been sending these over to me. These are headlines in the last 10 or 12 days, which owes partially to the Univision deal. Divisive problem. The GOP's ruinous immigration stance. This was a Washington Post article. Debate no-shows worry GOP leaders. Also Washington Post article. And actually also a Washington Post article. His hard tasks, sell Hispanics on the GOP, about Senator Mel Martinez and his role in the RNC. Some things have been happening recently. I mean, I had to take a double take when I saw that Massey Villarreal had endorsed Rick Noriega for the Senate, including his comments. Is he still the president of the National Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, or a past?
Massey's a dear friend of mine. I'm not sure if he's still
former chair. And then the one that I really had to do a double take on was Lionel Sosa endorsing Bill Richardson for president. Sort of the dean of admin in San Antonio. So just something to think about, because this is the sort of the 500-pound gorilla in the back of this discussion. Is Texas going to go the way of California? What kind of an impact is this going to have? But I don't want to hear myself talk anymore. I want to open this up for questions. We have about 20, 30 minutes. So do we have any questions out there?
Before you do, Paul,
sure.
I would just say that Lionel Sosa is the vice dean after Frank.
I'll take that back. I'll take that back seat to Mike.
I was deferring to age. Questions out there?
This question for Dr. Shaw. your polling information available somewhere online, or is it so important that you can access?
Yeah, actually, you can access it through texaslyceum.org. And we've not only made the instrument available, but also the crosstabs and the raw data set. And this is a survey of adults, and so one of the things that happened when we put the survey out was the election numbers looked very, very positive for the Democrats, because our sample is reflective of the state population, so it's roughly 30% Hispanic. And as Mike pointed out,
over us politically, and it's something that Republicans are going to have to deal with in the next election. So if you factor in that, and we saw it happen in 2006, and it's not a normal election, but some percentage of Republicans sit home, guess what? The Democrat vote becomes more, the Hispanic percentage of the turnout becomes more. Now you're pushing in the upper teens, and you're getting a little closer.
yeah. One of the things that's interesting is you look at the difference between Gen Y voters, generally, irrespective of ethnicity, Gen Y voters versus Gen X, boomers, and war generation voters. Gen Y has come in as a very Democratic cohort. And that's especially true with Hispanics. So a lot of Republicans, of course, at the outset of the decade were thinking, well, you're going to lose the back end of a very Democratic cohort, the New Dealers, basically, both Hispanic and Anglo, very heavily Democratic. They're going to be replaced by, even if it's a 50-50 cohort, Republicans gain. But in fact, Gen Y is at least as Democratic right now as the New Deal cohort they're replacing. So Republicans kind of expected to make up some ground. That doesn't look like it's happening. Now, these people could get more conservative as they get older, but they've been very Democratic so far across all ethnicities.
I'm Tamara Coody. I'm a Republican in the Ken Mellon, Carl Rove, the few Republicans who figured out that we need Hispanic voters camp. I mean, you put us in a phone booth, but never mind, there are a few of us. And I want to press a little on that issue, which is, I guess, the issue evoked in your headlines. Frank, I really appreciate your kind of optimism that it's still a race. I'm worried that it's not a race anymore and isn't going to be for the next several decades, thanks to kind of what the Republicans have been doing for the last, 2, 3, 4 years, especially on immigration. And that's certainly the conventional wisdom. I didn't hear too much of it from anyone up there. Is it wrong? Is it right? I mean, I'm ready to go to sleep and wake up in 20 years. Is there going to be a battle? And what do Republicans have to do to win it?
Well, these things, I worked on the no side of Prop 187 in California back in '94, which was the vehicle that, quite frankly, helped Pete Wilson get re-elected governor, and it was the one that cut off a lot of services to illegal immigrants. And you got to be careful how you work with this issue, because Republicans, while a lot of people do want border security, you have to be careful how this works with immigrants and how it works into the Hispanic community and culture. Let me read you something here, all right? And Frank's heard this before. I think Louis heard this before. They must not vote. 1,124 fresh Democrats just imported. England and other European powers are landing in hordes upon our shores, all the refuge and offscourings of their population. Are we to stand by idly while this is happening at such a rate? Is our fair land to be the only receptacle of all the useless inhabitants of Europe? They must not vote. And they're going to have to be supported by us, it says. I don't even know what the social system was back when this was written. Anybody have a guess when this was written?
Irish.
Last week?
That's right. It was written in 1847, and they're talking about my ancestors. On my Irish side, I'm half Irish. They came over right around that time, and it hurt for generations. In 1980, my grandmother's asking me, "Are you going to vote in this primary where Kennedy may take on Carter?" I said, "No, Mom. I think I'm going to vote in the Republican." "What? But you're Irish." "Yeah." "Well, that means you're a Democrat." "Well, not necessarily." She was totally confused and upset. It took generations for that shift to occur. California has suffered since the mid-'90s because of what that proposition did. And you have to be careful how you deal with border security and the language that's used and the proposals that are put forth. That doesn't mean that a generation is lost politically across the nation. The nation's still very divided. Only 3 states changed hands between 2000 and 2004 on the electoral map. So, and I expect another close one, as long as Republicans wake up and turn out, which they may not do like they did in 2006. But we have to be very careful how to include Hispanics and not have language like this that excludes them.
I think it's what, back during the governor's reelection, we were very clear in talking about border security, and we distinguished that, and it polled really, really well, even along the border cities, because Hispanics are concerned about their safety, but we didn't talk about keeping them out, just secure. I mean, people are afraid to go across anymore. There were kidnappings going on, and so I think it's not lost on Republicans to capture more Hispanic vote. I just think we've got to watch the way that we phrase things. The people that some of the people that are trotted out on our side. I told Kelly earlier, like, oh my God, I turned the radio off or turned the TV off, just wondering, it's almost an attack on me when I'm listening to them. And these are folks that are on my side of the aisle, but we've got to be careful how we approach it.
The problem is other people are being careful. They're doing the opposite. They're pandering to the other side of the party.
I'll jump in there. You know what? A lot of people, like the governor, are being very careful because they understand that there's the primary equation where Hispanics don't fit in, and then there's the general election equation where they certainly do. The problem is that there's a smaller handful of people who live in places where it is absolutely the best thing for them to do to smash everyone. And so the problem is that those are the people that get trotted out, they get highlighted, their sound bites make the news, and that's how Republicans get portrayed. And so it is going to be damaging because I'll tell you, there are Hispanics that are in one side and in the other. And even the people who are in agreement fundamentally with how that vote might play out, they're really troubled by the tenor of the conversation. That's what's damaging.
Senator Barrientos?
Dr. Shaw, could you define Hispanic, and then how did you pick your respondents, and what location or state or what have you? Right. Finally, Mr. Fero, how much do you think money had to do with the Republicans getting 30% of the Hispanic vote?
Okay. Since this is a random digit dial of all adults in the state of Texas, it's self-identified ethnicity. We gave people opportunities to identify. There's first a race question, white versus black, and then there's an ethnicity question within that. Now, so you get people in multiple categories. You can be black and Hispanic. You can, as you know, on the race question, most Hispanics obviously identify as white and then identify as Hispanic. We actually didn't go beyond Hispanic in terms of ethnicity, so we didn't ask Mexican-American versus Guatemalan, et cetera, but it's self-rated. And what you're seeing is the problem with most traditional surveys is that they'll actually break, and Mike's quite familiar with this, we break the state into clusters. And what you'll get is a series of different clusters, and you get a Hispanic cluster. So certain counties, or better, certain precincts are identified as Hispanic, and they'll sample from within those particular precincts, and that constitutes their Hispanic subsample. The problem with that is not all Hispanics live in homogeneous neighborhoods. And it's increasingly a problem. The language issue is probably the foremost problem. But a second problem is actually drawing a representative sample of Hispanics from heterogeneous neighborhoods. So, and the problem, convincing people to do this is that, if you want to do, say, a Hispanic sample, most companies will say, oh, we'll sell you a list of, high probability Hispanic neighborhoods. And say, well, I'd like to get some of these from, the suburbs and other areas, and say, well, then we have to dial a lot because it's a low incidence population, and we're getting a lot of hang-ups, and it's really hard. That's the justification, hard and expensive. Since this covered the entire state, and it wasn't specifically designed just to get Hispanics, we allowed them to self-ID. And got more, we wanted at least 1,000 people so we get enough Hispanics to have a credible subsample.
To the question of how much did money factor into the Hispanic vote of 30%, I think there are two main answers to that. One is, going to what Daron just said, Hispanics are not in enclaves anymore, and we have assimilated into the general society, and some of your neighbors are Hispanic, and so that sort of mainstream notion that has taken place, going to Frank's point about the commercial appeal to Hispanics. Hispanics are available to a lot of different messages. Hispanics, like all other maturing voting blocs, have a tendency to flow to power, flow to the winning side or the perceived winning side, just like Anglos do and African Americans to a lesser extent do. Asians do, a group we haven't talked about today. So I think that the money was significant because it was able to deliver a message to Hispanics who are in transition, like others are, and were available to that message. I also think on the other side of that, what has just been said about the danger in your question about the perceived intolerance currently out there among Republicans toward Hispanics is a message that's a lot stronger than that 30% message. And then all that money that achieved 30%, the message you're referring to is a lot stronger, and frankly for Democrats a lot cheaper for us to stand back and let that message. I mean, I'm a Democrat, and James and I are trying to be on our best behavior today, and I won't hold you to that, but speaking in a partisan way, I think there is a narrative that has been cast over the last few years that's going to be in place for a long time.
Question of the man in the tie over there.
Could y'all talk about some of the salient characteristics of Hispanic individuals who are first generation compared to citizens compared to second, third, 12th generation?
Well, it's all over the place. There's everything from income level to media consumption. I mean, it moves so wildly. I'll tell you, interestingly, if we take the immigration conversation out of here, which I think definitely affects this, what I've told groups around the country is I think there are actually two groups that are that Republican Party can appeal to. And everybody says, well, it's the generation, it's the multi-generational folks that are here, and it's obviously them. Well, that's one. But the other one is actually the new arrivals. I really think that the new arrivals, if they again, taking the immigration conversation out of here, could be very open to Republican messages. Because I spoke to a group of folks in New Mexico, and I said, imagine that you're not from New Mexico, you're from Mexico, and you've just left your home, or somewhere south of there, and you've left your home, you've left your family behind, you've traveled to a country you've never been to, you've gotten here by some means that was probably dangerous or expensive, and you'll take a job and you'll work hard, and if somebody says, look, you got to pay part of your fair share, they're fair people, and they would do that. And ultimately what they want to do is they want to keep as much of it as they can in their pocket to send back to their family. And depending on where they're from, there's some level of mistrust of government. I said, now, who does that sound like? And this group of Republicans, it sounds like us. And I said, but these are the new immigrants. This conversation, unfortunately, took place 2 years ago, and in the last 2 years, there's been a different kind of discourse out there. So how does that become affected? I don't know. But I think from whether it's somebody who's just walked into the country or somebody who's fifth generation, there are worlds of difference between these folks in too many ways to enumerate.
Back over there.
Several people have talked about the idea of a message in getting the Hispanic vote and about the importance of an issue shift. But my question is, what do you think the role of image is in the message that's being communicated to Hispanic voters?
I try to get as many of our clients, and whether they're Anglos or Hispanics, to always talk about things in a multi-generational context. I think you need to have your TV ads with your parents or with your kids. It's got to show that still that sense of community and that sense of obligation and that sense of sacrifice. I mean, especially I think for a Democratic side, the cool thing is when you're talking to Hispanics in a cultural code, you really are talking to a lot of the conservative values of Anglo independence. And that's the opportunity that Democrats really have, is that we can be talking to Hispanics who many of them watch mainstream television and English-dominant television, but they can see themselves in it, but we're not alienating Anglos at the same time. A lot of what's going on the issue thing, too, is not just how Hispanics are moving more Democratic because of the, I'll be polite, the change in tenor of the debate on the Republican side on immigration and other issues. That's really affecting a lot of independent white women as well. And what you see often, while they don't do the want to be shown debate, Newt Gingrich will do a meeting with the, Hispanic leaders or something. That isn't that they're going to make humongous gains among Hispanics, but it is really a sense that independent women, especially independent white women, don't want to see that kind of confrontation, that conflict, and sense of hatred and divide.
Neil Burns in the advertising department.
Hi, thanks. I'd like to know from those of you that are doing surveys, what you do with these issues, and there's some of them that I try to confront, given the fact that you may be using, let's say, random digit dialing, how do we deal with those who respond and the hang-ups for documented respondents, particularly with Hispanic surnames versus undocumented? Some people call it legal versus illegal. And then what do you do about the large, even with all due difference to one of the sponsors of this wonderful new center, the attrition from their ranks of people moving to cell phones is a problem that AT&T is constantly dealing with. And so what do we do about the population that doesn't have their phone number in their web pages or white pages?
I could say a few things about that, because it is, on the second point, with more and more people, younger people, going to cell phones, that includes then more of the younger Hispanics, because if you break it down, the younger community, the under 30 voters are more Hispanic than those that are 30 years of age or older. There's a ruling that says that that you're not to auto-dial cell phones, but you can hand dial all you want. It's the silliest rule that the FCC has. This bastion of cell phones and mobile phones back in the early 90s was supposed to be protected. And so we're missing out on people, quite frankly, more and more. And there's been conferences about missing out on those individuals. So it's going to make polling more expensive to try and reach those that have landlines. And you can have to make some assumptions or fill it in some other way through internet surveys or something to reach these individuals that are on cell phones. It's a good point. We should be looking at those that have a Spanish surname, and I had some voter surveys where for the listed numbers that are on the file that have a Spanish surname, we should look a little closer at what happens with the disconnect among those numbers that are dialed versus non-Spanish surnames, because we have about 21% of the voter file in Texas has a Spanish surname, and it's indicated. It either has an H or it's a blank. So we should look at that and see what the difference is. But keep in mind, I'm dealing with voters. And so they're here, they're typically, if they have a landline and they're registered to vote, what I've seen in the past is that we can find them just about as easily as we can find anybody else. But there are cases, and I did this with Bonilla in past cycles, where we find ourselves a little short on the Hispanic interviews that we thought we should have by different regions. So we'd have to go take a segment of the voter file and randomly dial just those that have the Hispanic surname. Right. So there are things that can be done to make up the difference.
Let me just jump in. Mike's sort of last comment is basically the solution at this point. With respect to cell phones, I think the legislation that's passed that stopped, cold calling basically for commercial reasons has bought us about another year or so, because what's actually happened is the response rates to traditional polling have gone up because people are no longer screening thinking that they're going to be telemarketed. Political people can still basically political telemarket them with surveys, but so it's a loophole that has bought us a little bit of time. But we're clearly going to internet-based polling. I mean, there's no question about that. Now, for our particular survey, the truth is, and this gets to Senator Barrientos' point also, we're light on young Hispanics. Now, this is kind of interesting, right? I mean, you'd think, getting also back to Jim's question about generational effects, that people who are 2 or 3 generations, maybe who aren't as comfortable in speaking English as opposed to the younger kids, that they'd be less likely to speak. Actually, we do okay with them. It's the young people that we're just getting killed with. And what you'll often see in samples, and we did this a little bit in ours, to be honest with you. I think we ended up, in that particular strata, the cell, we needed, for instance, I'm making this off the top of my head, but something like we expected 21 18 to 24-year-old Hispanic males out of the sample. And you end up with 15. And what we do is you weight up, and you're making a heroic assumption. You're making an assumption that the people you got look just like the people you didn't get. And is that true? Is there something systematically different about people who wouldn't respond or who hung up or whatever? There probably is. And so we're living with that air until you move to greater internet coverage so that some of these problems can be resolved. And there are countries like Polymetrics out in Palo Alto, which is basically developing an enormous pool of Hispanic participants from whom they'll actually do polls in the future. So there's sort of opt-in surveys in exchange for some kind of recompense, and they form the basis of a pool that'll eventually, get large enough so you can do legitimate social scientific type sampling. But right now we're kind of in a nether region, both because of cell phones and the digital divide, the absence of complete internet access.
As a pollster or former pollster who probably was never involved in a successful campaign in Louisiana, I'm going to bring this methodological discussion to a close. We have a lunchtime panel that's going to follow right now with Tamar Jacoby, Eddie Aldrete, and I believe I saw Representative Pete Gallego and one of his constituents carrying the largest cowboy hat I've seen here in a while, or hat. I want to also encourage you, if you have to leave at 2:45, Ray Martinez, who is heading our Hispanic Policy Leadership Institute over here, does not want to have just me in the audience when we have all the people talking about issues of importance in the Hispanic community. It's a fabulous panel as well. But the one thing I need to know from our director is, what do people do now?
Everyone will proceed to room 3.102. There's elevators out to your left. There's also some stairs. Volunteers can direct you. We have our setup there for lunch. For those of you who registered late, I think we can accommodate everyone, but if not, we also have this room as an overflow room, and the program will be webcast to this room. For those who do not have seating upstairs, we'll have rooms available for you here as well.
One final comment over here. This is what the Center for Politics and Governance wants to be able to do on a regular basis here at UT. I think that anyone that knows anything about politics and thinks about it realizes, as Ronnie says, that someday, maybe sooner rather than later, the governor of Texas is going to be Hispanic. There are going to be more Hispanic members of the legislature, and I think you're going to begin to see, if you haven't already begun to see it, people getting elected who are Hispanic in places you didn't even know there were Hispanic populations. This is an important part of the way our state is going to be governed in the future, and I thank everybody over here. I thank all the members of the panel, and I hope to see much more of this in the future.